Welcome back to Conversations. I'm Bill Kristol, and I'm very pleased to have with me again Peter Thiel, innovator, entrepreneur, businessman, thinker on many topics, imaginative and unconventional thinker on politics, economics, society. So thank you, Peter, for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
Good to have you. We were just discussing before this that you're back pretty recently from China. This is now May of 2016. And you had interesting things to say about that. So I thought we'd just begin such a huge issue in terms of the international economy and the future of the world politically and economically. Well, what struck you in China?
Well, it's a combination of incredible determination, incredible hard work on the part of people. I taught a mini course at Tsinghua University, one of the elite universities in China. So there's incredible interst. And,
your book was a huge seller in China, right?
It sold it did very well throughout the world, the 0 to 1 book, but probably sold more copies in China than the rest of the world combined.
Is that right?
So wow. There's an incredible and intense interest in technology, how to do new things. And then at the same time, there's also this very palpable sense that the model that's worked so well for the last 30, 35, 40 years of globalization, of growth through trade, extensive growth, copying things, is reaching some kind of a natural limit. And so I think there is this very challenging transition China is going through in terms of finding a new growth model. It's not clear everybody can become an entrepreneur or anything like that, even though you have various Communist Party slogans of mass entrepreneurship and things that sound slightly oxymoronic in that sort of vein.
So they have. What did you find among especially the students? Confidence in the future, worries about the future, the desire to change the system, not?
Well, I think there always are things you can talk about and that you cannot talk about in that sort of a place. But there's incredible drive to succeed, and then there's always a question: how does one interpret interest in startups and entrepreneurship? And on the surface, it always seems to be very optimistic, very ambitious. And then I think just beneath the surface, it often also goes to a lot of anxieties around how tracked careers, how working in a large state-owned enterprise or in sort of a government functionary isn't quite what it used to be, or may not work as well in the next 20 or 30 years as it has in the last 20 or 30. So, so I think and I think we often have had this with these booms or bubbles where on the surface it's extreme optimism. The 90s we had extreme optimism about the new economy in the U.S., and then just beneath the surface it was this sense that the old economy was no longer working and there was no future in the old economy. And so I've sort of been wondering if something like that is going on in China today as well. But this, again, it's always hard to know. It's a vast country, 1.3 billion or more people, and so it's hard to really generalize about something like that from just talking to a few students in an elite university.
But do the students think, and I guess what's your own judgment of this too? I mean, are they fascinated by 0 to 1 because they think, well, we could do that in China too, or is it, gee, they can do that in the U.S. but we can't do it in China?
Well, I think it's interesting precisely because that's sort of the cusp of the debate, and so the two kinds of critiques my 0 to 1 book got would be, on the one hand, that of course China can innovate, and it's wrong for me to suggest otherwise, which I didn't really do, but there's sort of a sense that China gets linked with globalization. And so one critique is, yeah, we can innovate just as much as the West. And then the other critique of it is, well, 0 to 1 businesses are good for America and other countries. We don't need 0 to 1 businesses. We can just copy things that work. And so you have these two diametrically opposed critiques. We don't need to do this, or we're already doing it. That leads me to think that the truth is somewhere right in between, that there's a sense that they haven't needed to do it. They haven't needed to innovate for a long time. And this, of course, is the good part of globalization. You can copy things that work. If you're a very poor, very underdeveloped country, there's a lot of room for copying. And then at some point—
Huge increase in living standards.
Huge increase in living standards. And at some point, you run out of things to copy. And And there's a sense that this is what happened. This was the arc of Japan, sort of the Asian exemplar in some ways, where starting with the Meiji Restoration in the 1870s, and then all the way through the 1970s, 1980s, was incredibly dynamic. There were so many ways it wasn't a strictly capitalist model, but it somehow just worked. And then you sort of hit a wall in the 80s where they more or less caught up. There was nothing left to copy, and then it somehow failed to move beyond that. And then then you get the question: when does China hit a wall like Japan? It's a very similar model, export-oriented, current account surpluses. When do they hit a wall? If you look at it on per capita GDP, you would say it's roughly where Japan was in 1960. So you have maybe 20 years left to go on the copying. So if you look at per capita GDP, you'd say China's still, it's 1/7, 1/8 of the U.S. Japan got up to about 2/3 or 3/4 before they hit the wall. So you have a long way to go. And then if you look at it, maybe from trade flows, where in many goods China's manufacturing half the stuff that gets made in the world in that category, and you sort of wonder how much growth is there really left doing this, and you end up with this question whether maybe this model worked really well for Japan when it was the first country doing it, and it works much less well for China at a much bigger scale. And so maybe they're hitting this wall that Japan hit in the late 80s today in 2016.
And one of the most interesting things, I think this is in the book, and certainly in other things you've written in our previous conversation, I think we discussed this some, is people tend to muddy together, link to globalization and innovation, and I think you make the argument that they're quite different, actually.
Yes. Well, I always try to stress the difference, where I always draw globalization on an x-axis. It's copying things that work. It's going from one to end. It's horizontal, extensive growth. And then I always draw technology or innovation on a y-axis, going from 0 to 1, intensive, vertical progress, doing new things. So it's doing new things versus copying things that work. And there certainly is a sense that in a successful 21st century, we want to have both more globalization and more technology. But then there are probably some trade-offs in terms of where the stress gets placed. And if you look at the history of the last 200 years, we've had eras of technology and of globalization and of one or the other. The 19th century was an era of both tremendous globalization and tremendous technological progress from 1815, ending with the start of World War I in 1914, when globalization goes very much in reverse. Technology continues at a breakneck pace. And then I would date 1971 when Kissinger goes to China as the year where globalization begins again in earnest. And we have had 40 plus years now of breakneck globalization, but what I've argued is relatively more limited progress in technology, mostly centered on this narrow cone of progress around computers, software, internet, and not so much in many other areas of technology. And so the 20th century had a period of technology with less globalization, and then a more recent period of globalization with more limited technology. It's reflected in some ways in the different ways we talk about our world. So in 1965, when you had technology but no globalization, you would have described the world geopolitically as the first world and the third world.
Right.
The first world was that part that was technologically progressing. The third world was that part that was sort of permanently screwed up. Today, the dichotomy would be between the developed and developing worlds, which is a sort of convergence, homogenization, globalization theory of history. The developing world is converging with the developed world and becoming more and more alike. And so this is a pro-globalization dichotomy, but at the same time, it's also an anti-technological dichotomy, because when we say that we living in the United States or Western Europe or Japan are living in the so-called developed world, we are saying implicitly that we're living in that part of the world where nothing new is going to happen, where things are done, finished, and exhausted. And I feel that that's always a little bit too pessimistic. So I think in theory, we should have both globalization and technology. In practice, we certainly have choices that we make. On an individual level, do we work in ways that are more globalization-oriented, more technology-oriented? It's possible that over the last 40 years, there were so many gains from globalization that it was natural for talented people in our societies to work in those in industries that were linked to globalization, and perhaps those gains are a little bit more hard to come by now, and maybe it makes sense to rebalance towards technology. If you think of it geographically within the U.S., you could say that New York City is the city that was, it's linked to finance. Finance is the industry that's linked to globalization simply because it's about the global movement of capital. It's something that's very easy to move around the world. And so somehow the way the economy and the future was centered on New York City from, say, 1982 to 2007, for that quarter century, was the period when people really believed in globalization. And the sort of strange shift from New York City to Silicon Valley, I see as this shift where maybe we can get more out of technology. It's harder to make progress on globalization. And I still spend some time both in New York City and mostly in Silicon Valley. And it's always striking the sort of the extreme contrast, the sort of optimism in Silicon Valley, and then the sort of very deep pessimism that I feel always permeates New York, where there's this model that's not quite working anymore. And so that's what you see in New York City. And then I think, remarkably, I think that's what people also believe in China at this point, which again was, as a country, geared to this to a degree greater than perhaps anywhere else in the world.
And how much of a, I want to come back to New York City, that's so interesting, but, and I guess there's a real trade-off in terms of the regime and the political arrangements between the two. I mean, an arrangement that might work for just massive increases of globalization and prosperity may not work to encourage innovation. And if you're hitting the wall, so to speak, if the gains aren't coming as easily anymore from globalization, you could have political crises and other things.
Well, certainly we have, there's a number of things to say here. So certainly, I think growth can happen through some combination of globalization and technology, and we will have problems politically if there's not enough growth. And so I think there's some level on which the combination of globalization and technology hasn't been delivering as many goods as it should.
But in China, I'm thinking, I mean, how much of a crisis do they face? I mean, before we get back to us, in your judgment, is it hard to tell?
I think with respect to China, I think that globalization has been such an enormous driver. It seems to me hard to reorient it towards technology simply. There's so many, you have the Foxconn factory where people are manufacturing the iPhones, which again, I think more is globalization than technology. 1.3 million people employed there, and maybe that keeps going, maybe it gets redirected in some other way. But it's the transition, I think, is very far from trivial. It was a very big problem even in Japan, which arguably was globalization orientated, tried to shift towards something more innovative, and never quite cracked that open.
So China has big challenges ahead of it.
It's the bullish case is always that if you just look at per capita incomes, it would seem like there's still a tremendous room left for convergence. But my own sense for it is that it's possible that we're later in the globalization game than people think. There was it was part of the 2012 People's Congress, was sort of a statement, and I believe it was Li He, who's sort of the chief economic advisor to President Xi, included in the 2012 statement that the globalization tailwind that had helped China for 30-plus years was abating, and that you'd have to really think about how to reorient much of the economy, maybe towards internal consumption, maybe towards innovation, but away from a lot of the things that are working, and then a lot of the power structures, of course, linked to things that are working. Subsidies to the state-owned enterprises that export goods and that employ a lot of people. And so there's a question how easy it is to reorient that.
And I suppose that is where we presumably have some advantage as a free country, we're a free society with, where you can have a Silicon Valley in a way that I presumably is harder in a place like China.
Yes, it's always, I always worry that we're not as free a country as would be desirable, and that there are, certainly with respect to innovation, there are many areas where it's effectively been outlawed, not in the area of computers, which are still, I think, quite unregulated on the whole, and where there has been a lot of progress. But yeah, I think in the U.S. There definitely are large elements of our economy that have been linked to this globalization story as well. And if I had to do sort of a long, short version, I would try to be skeptical of the parts that are linked to globalization. I would if I was talking to a young person graduating from college, I would discourage them from working at a big money center bank in New York, or for McKinsey, or sort of the international global consulting firm, which is again a classic globalization career. Clinton Global Initiative. That sounds very dated at this point. That's so 2005. World Economic Forum. All these things have sort of a dated kind of a feel. This is the way the future used to be. It's not the way the future is.
Was 07, 08 the kind of will people look back and say that was the break point where we did have, in a way, it was literally a globalization of credit, which then turned out to be not as soundly based as people hoped, right?
Yeah, that's certainly the interpretation I would give of it, which was that it was a peak on globalization, on the belief in the emerging markets. So you had one of the acronyms in the 2000s was the BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then it turned out that a lot of it involved the investment of capital in these places that was misdirected, that there was a lot of corruption under the veneer of globalization, and maybe it wasn't going to work as simply as people thought. And I would argue that since 2008, it's not like the tide has really gone out. It's still been held together. The global trade flows were growing at 2 to 3 times the rate of GDP growth for 30 years before 2008. And they've stayed roughly in line since then. So the tide hasn't really come out, but it's stopped advancing. But I think it's been held together much more by political will and much less by widespread belief. One miniature version of this global project has been the European Union project, where you could say in 2007, 2008, people really believed it. And so a German saver would naturally buy Greek government bonds. You got a higher interest rate in Greece, and of course it would eventually converge to a German rate because everything was going to converge. Post-2008, there's a lot more skepticism. There would be no natural way that money would flow from northern to southern Europe today. And so it's only to sort of keep the European system balanced has required massive state interventions to flow the money to buy the bonds in southern Europe because the people themselves no longer believe it. And I think there's sort of all these versions of it where it's been held together by will. And I wonder whether the tide is really going to start going out in the years ahead.
Yeah, one does have the feeling, just looking at Europe and at China in a different way, the political elites are, and one can understand why they're doing this, and they're not necessarily wrong to do it in the case of Europe, I suppose, sort of holding the thing together, but now it's fighting against it's holding something together that's already, from which the benefits have already been derived, and now you're beginning to see the downside, as opposed to let's all ride up, as you say, the 90s kind of, we're all just riding onto a bright, happy future together,
Well, I think the elites are right in that the alternatives to globalization always seem really bad.
Right.
So, in Europe it was, 2 world wars, and so even if we have a sclerotic, corrupt bureaucracy in Brussels, that seems better than what happened between 1914 and 1945 in Europe. And so I think there is always this negative worry that the alternatives to globalization are all bad. But I think, even though I think that's correct, that shouldn't blind us to the possibility that a lot of what goes under globalization may also have been bad. And so if it is just a way for, dictators in emerging market countries to abscond with money into Swiss bank accounts, or if it's a way for terrorists to sort of freely travel throughout the world and use our global communications and global transportation networks, if it's a globalization of violence through terror, things like that, there are all sorts of forms of it that can be bad. So even though globalization ending would be an unmitigated disaster, we have to, I think, we should be much more, we should try to draw much tighter distinctions between what forms of globalization have been good, which ones have been bad, and not just have this sort of this Panglossian World Economic Forum, Clinton Global Foundation, that if it has the word global, it must simply be good.
No, that's interesting. And also, I guess one could take the position that it might have been good, mostly, for X number of years or decades, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. It was a reasonable, the standard of living of hundreds of millions, I suppose billions of people increased in China and India, and parts of Central and Eastern Europe that had historically been hugely unstable became reasonably stable and better off. But so that something was good for 4 or 5 decades doesn't mean it's good for it doesn't mean that you can simply keep applying that formula for the next 4 or 5 decades. That seems to be very much the view of the European Union, and in a weird way, I suppose the Chinese, the Chinese Communist Party too. Of
Yes.
if we're just going to keep doing what we were doing, but the world doesn't quite work that way, presumably.
And it may be. It may even be somewhat good. So I tend to think if we had more trade agreements, this would be generally a good thing.
Right.
But the incremental value of
Starts to
the
go
next
down.
trade agreement may not be as high as the ones we already have. And so if we ask where we're going to really get the drivers to take our civilization to the next level in the decades ahead, maybe it is not the same formula over and over again.
So let's go to that, because you've been an articulate proponent and very much a contrarian proponent, though I think people are beginning to come around a bit to the argument of the innovation slowdown, and that not that it necessarily, that we've merged in our own mind, let's say, globalization and innovation, and everything's better than it was, and then the computers became a stand-in for all kinds of innovation. But in fact, in many important areas, innovation has been less than we would have expected it to have been, and is less than it could be. Is that right? I mean,
Yeah, certainly if we went back to, say, 1968 or the late 60s, and you asked where would people have thought the world would be by the year 2000, 2015, 2016, it's fallen way short. If you look at the Back to the Future movie, the Back to the Future one was 1985. They went back in time 30 years, and things had changed quite a bit from 55 to 85.
Right.
There's still been a decent amount of changes. Back to the Future 2 went from 85 to 2015, 30 years into the future, like it was about a little under a year ago. And that was a world that was supposed to be radically different. And I think the actual day-to-day changes outside of computers would have been quite modest in those 30 years, or even, I would argue, since the 1970s. And so you can sort of rattle off these different areas, whether it's biotechnology, where there's been some progress, but it seems to have decelerated, space travel, transportation more generally, all kinds of ideas people had in the 50s and 60s about, reforesting the deserts or underwater cities, or all kinds of things like this that at this point.
new forms of energies.
Yeah, fusion,
Right.
New forms of nuclear power that at this point all have this sort of retro future
Right.
feel. It's like it's the future the way it used to be. Star Trek feels very dated. There's sort of these things feel very dated in their optimism about how much could be done. And so yeah, I do think there always are different things that are going on. There's acceleration in some places. There's stagnation. There's increasing inequality. So you have sort of different themes. But I think that in a lot of these debates, I would say it's 70% is probably stagnation, and that if we focus too much on inequality or acceleration, we're going to get a lot of the public policy debates wrong. So if you focus too much on accelerations, Professor McAfee at MIT, the second machine age, is this runaway technological progress, and then it's going to lead to more inequality, and so you need to deal. So it's both this really good thing, has some problems, and then that sort of pushes you in a certain set of policy directions of what to do, or the even more optimistic ones are things like Ray Kurzweil with The Singularity is Near, where we have this accelerating future, and all you need to do is sort of sit back in your chair, eat some popcorn, and watch the movie of the future unfold. And then the kinds of policy debates that we end in this accelerating world tend to be, I find, sort of incredibly ethically charged, where it always ends up being good versus evil technology. And so the technology is so overpowering that the main risks are that it's going to destroy us all. And so you have utopian forms and dystopian forms and nothing in between. And so you have the worries in Silicon Valley about AI, or do you really want to live forever, or is that just ethically bad? Whereas in the stagnation side, the antonym to good is not evil. The antonym is bad. And the problem from my perspective is not so much that we have evil technologies that are going to destroy the world, but that we have a lot of bad technologies and bad science that simply doesn't work. So where evil has more this ethical
Right.
thing, and bad has more the sense of not working. If there's an ethical, moral version of it, it's that people are lying about the science, they're lying about the technology, and they're saying that it's really incredible when it's often not quite living up to what it is. So I find myself much more in this that the stagnation is the general dynamic, and it's reflected in the economic data where median wages have been stagnant for 40+ years. The younger generation has reduced expectations from their parents, and sort of this very broad sort of social, cultural indicators that suggest that things feel kind of stuck. And then you have a very different set of questions. What do you do about it? What's gone wrong? How do we get out of it?
How much of it is in our control? Are we just hitting natural limits? I mean, that would be a question, I suppose, right?
Yeah. So I think that to the extent you see it as a technological problem or a scientific problem, one approach has been that you're just hitting natural limits. This is Tyler Cohen, The Great Stagnation, a recent book by Robert Gordon, another economist, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And so it was this idea that there were some fairly simple inventions in the 19th, early 20th century, that maybe the rate of innovation peaked as far back as the late 19th century,
right,
where you had incredible numbers of breakthroughs, and it's just the nature of the world, of the universe, that it's much harder to find new things. The low-hanging fruit has been picked, and therefore we have to sort of resign ourselves to far reduced expectations and sort of a more austere future.
I just read somewhere a quote in an article, which not the whole, it wasn't an argument, just a statement. You only invent antibiotics once. I mean, if you have massive gains in public health by a huge breakthrough like that, where half your population isn't dying from infections, basically, and public health disasters and in infancy,
yes,
you can't replicate that.
Yes, so
right?
those are the arguments on the
right,
nature side. I'm a little bit more partial to the culture side of this, that perhaps perhaps there never was any low-hanging fruit. The fruit was always of at least intermediate height, and it
right,
looked always pretty high up.
Yeah, they didn't think at the time that, hey, these are easy breakthroughs,
These
right?
are easy breakthroughs.
Yeah.
And certainly, we have a situation where 1/3 of the people at age 85 suffer from dementia or Alzheimer's, and you would so if you could do something about that, that would probably be close to as big a deal as antibiotics. But we're living in a world where people don't even expect that to happen anymore, I think.
So what are the core problems there, do you think? I mean, what is the education, regulation? I mean, is it government? Is it just the culture as a whole?
Yeah, I suspect this is, all these questions, why this is happening, why questions I think are always hard to answer. They're always a little bit overdetermined.
Right.
My sense is that to some extent it is all of the above. But I think there is a big hysteresis part to this, where there's a way in which success begets success, and then failure begets failure. Where if you haven't had any major successes in a number of decades, it does induce a certain amount of learned helplessness, and then it shifts the way science gets done or the way innovation gets done into this sort of more bureaucratic political structure, where the people who got the research grants are more the politicians than the scientists. You're rewarded for very small incremental progress, not for trying to take risk, and so it's led over time to a more incrementalist, egalitarian, risk-averse approach, which I think has not worked all that well.
And so how does one change that, apart from telling people that they should take risks? I mean,
it's not clear. It's not clear how you change it on a cultural, political level.
Right.
I'm always focused on the sort of very modest startup version, which doesn't actually work for everything. And I think it's sort of like it's a very imperfect solution. So I think you can convince a small number of people to start a new business or to do something new. Convincing a much larger number of people to change things,
right,
I think is sort of a much more challenging problem, and then this gets to all these questions about, can you reform government research structures?
Right.
Can you reform NASA? Can you reform the universities? Can you reform even large corporations that in many ways are not much better than the universities or the governments? Maybe a little bit, but not as much as we often like to think.
And I suppose one way to think about it, and this is something you've thought a lot about, and is well, we do seem to have one area where we have had pretty massive breakthroughs, bigger than anticipated. The one case maybe where Back to the Future 2015 to 85 really is a genuine quantum leap, so to speak, and that is computers and related technologies, information, and so forth. And could one then just say, well, let's go back and look at what happened there and what the structures were there and the incentives were there and the culture was there, and why couldn't we then, mutatis mutandis, try to make that more prevalent in other areas? I mean, that would be sort of a simple, but minded but reasonable approach.
Yeah, that would certainly be my naive intuition. So it was relatively unregulated, which again might be harder to do in energy or medicine or some of these other areas. There were parts of it that were not that capital intensive, so you could get started with relatively small amounts of capital. And there's a question, is that true? Are there areas of science where that's true, or are there places where if you need to have, $50 million to test a new experimental design for a nuclear reactor, does that necessarily become this deeply political process where you're at risk of the money going to precisely the wrong people every single time?
Right.
So it was lower capital intensity. There was it was less regulated. And then I also think there's been this history of success where over time you've attracted very talented people who believe they can do things. And one shouldn't understate how much that sort of belief is effectual. One of my friends was years ago was looking to join a big biotech company, and it was the pitch to people with PhDs coming out of graduate school was that we have a better softball team than the other biotech companies, because whether or not you discover something is so random, so unpredictable that the only thing we can sort of control about your work environment is to tell you that you're going to have a better softball team. And that's why you should join our firm. And so there's something around a lot of these areas where it felt that people were too much of a small cog in a giant machine, very hard to actually impact things, and there was sort of less of a sense of human agency. So I think that's what we always have to come back to, is how do we come back to a real sense of agency?
It does seem like the safety and environmental regulations just are so massive, and others I'm sure too, are so massive in the medical areas, the energy areas, transportation, and then just the political, obstacles, the rent seeking and the current, the people who currently occupy things, making it hard to make progress. I mean, which I guess didn't happen, or of course after the fact, as you say, everything's overdetermined, right? One could have thought in 1985 that it's not like there was no one in the computer or information technology field, and they were presumably interested in blocking new entrants, but somehow it didn't work that way.
Yeah, it's a complicated history.
We had
the thalidomide disaster with the FDA, so there's specific things you can point to that went very wrong. But yeah, I think today you would not get the polio vaccine approved. When it was first used, they dosed it wrong, and I think they gave 10 or 15 people got polio accidentally, and so today that would probably slow it down for another 20 years or something like that. So I do wonder whether we've become too risk averse in various ways. But even this concept of risk is a very strange concept. If you do a Google, one of the things you can do on Google is search for words and the frequency with which they occur in books over time. If you look at the word risk over the last 200 years, from 1800 to 2000, it's sort of a very infrequent word, very rare until about 1970.
Is that
and
right?
Then it goes up at an incredibly steep curve. And it becomes sort of this much more common in titles, how to manage risk, how to take risk, and so the thought I've been wondering about is whether a lot of talk about risk is actually even counterproductive to risk. That if you have a risk that if your kids are left unsupervised at the playground that they'll be kidnapped, or if you have a risk that this can go wrong or that can go wrong, or a risk that somebody's going to die from some new medical treatment, that risk is actually this word that's used to discourage people from doing anything, and its more and more frequent occurrence is a symptom of a society in which less and less good risk-taking is actually taking place.
A friend of mine who's on the board of a financial institution says they spend more time at their, and I'm not sure this is bad incidentally, but I'm just reporting this, they spend more time at their board meetings discussing the management of risk than actually making money.
Yes.
It's minimizing the downside.
Yes.
And it's not a stupid thing to be worried about, obviously,
Yes.
especially after 2007 and 8, but at some point you sort of, there's a bit of a, you're spending more time on the insurance to ensure that there's no disaster from the products that you're making than the products that you're making, right?
Yes.
And I think diversification, you've written about this some, right? The kind of degree to which venture capital is, people think of in terms of diversifying instead of.
Yeah, there's all these ways where I wonder whether the focus on the sort of processes of risk minimization distracts you from the substance of ideas, of figuring things out, of doing new things. And so yeah, so I think definitely something like that seems to have been very much at work. And I think that one of the things that's true about risk is that it's sort of this very probabilistic way of thinking about the future, where the future is dominated by chance, by fortune, and that's sort of this all-powerful force that dominates everything. And I think it's, one of the questions that I think is very unclear is whether this is this in fact a deep truth about the universe, or is it more about the abdication of our responsibilities? And so, as a venture capitalist, I'm always tempted to, the temptation is always, you look at a company, you say, don't really know if it's going to work or not. I'm just going to invest a small amount, see what happens. And the temptation is to treat all these companies as lottery tickets.
Right.
But once you treat them as lottery tickets, I found you've somehow psyched yourself into losing, because you've already psyched yourself into writing too many checks a little bit too quickly, and you're not actually making a statement about the inherent chanciness of the universe. You're actually making much more statement about your own laziness and your own unwillingness to try to really think things through. And so I do wonder whether there's something like that that gets obfuscated by this talk about risk, where it always sounds like it's a statement about the larger world, but it may really be more a statement about the failure of our ability to think things through, and maybe it is hard to precisely model these things out or something like that. In the case of startups and very innovative businesses, it's always quite unclear to me how you even talk about risk or probability, and so you can talk about it if you can do an experiment many times and see what happens over and over again. So if you did high frequency trading on Wall Street, that has a probabilistic character where you can probably model the risks very, very precisely. But if you're investing in a one-of-a-kind company, I don't even know how you'd go about measuring what the risks are, how you would quantify it, and if you have a sample size of one, standard deviation is infinite. And so, in theory, you can't say anything about the risk. If Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook over again 1,000 times, how often would it work? We don't get to run that experiment.
Right.
And so somehow risk-orientated processes, they make sense in a context of large N. So insurance is a context of large N. We have millions of people driving cars, so many have accidents, we can sort of model it out, or life insurance policies, actuarial science. These are all sort of large N sciences. But I think there are a lot of very important things that are small n, or even n equals 1, or it's a very small number. And if we're too beholden to these risk models, I think we just don't do those kinds of things, and they may be very important.
Yeah, and the large N things, the insurance schemes, are important for the maintaining the stability of society, and taking care of people who are afflicted by bad luck and bad circumstances. But it doesn't get you. It doesn't. You could have a perfectly insured, right, a perfectly running insurance scheme, so to speak,
right,
and never have any progress. I guess is a simple-minded way to put it.
Or the even more extreme way I would put it is, if you had a perfectly running insurance scheme, it would probably collapse under its own weight eventually. And so if you think of our education system as largely an insurance policy, the universities are largely this insurance policy for upper middle class parents who are scared that their kids are going to fall through the ever bigger cracks in our society. It can sort of work, but are we really going to have a future in which everybody's insured? And isn't that a recipe for disaster over time, where nothing?
Sort of the welfare state is a reasonable supplement to a growth economy.
But it can't work as the be all and end all for everybody.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I think in the same way, a super low risk thing, there are parts of it where it can work, but it probably can't work universally, and I don't think it can work remotely as extensively as it has been done. You know, the ways I was guilty of this. I went to law school. It was sort of the low risk, seemingly low risk thing to do from undergraduate in the late '80s, early '90s when I went to law school, and it was this fairly low risk way to get sort of a upper middle class career in a big law firm. And in retrospect, I think it's turned out to be quite high risk for a lot of the people who did it because there were far too many people who did it. You know, it worked well for a few years, and then a lot of things just tend to go wrong, even for the people who come out of these very successful, tract kind of places. So, you know, if you wanted to date this, maybe in 1965 or 1970, if you're graduating from college, there was actually a way that you could do a low-risk, very successful career. So few people were doing it that, you know, and there was a way you could sort of arbitrage this risk successfully. Don't think that's been working terribly well. I think that's been working less and less well for the last 30, 40 years, even as it's been understood better and better. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, people forget, and you know much more about this than I do, but the 07, 08 crash, the instruments that are generally thought to have contributed to the crash, at least, and to have gotten out of control. And it turns out people didn't know what they were holding, and one thing led to another, the kind of knock-on effects were precisely supposed to be lessening risk.
Yes.
It wasn't quite right that many people on Wall Street thought, hey, let's gamble.
Yes.
Some did, and there were, but really it was the opposite. It was if we can spread, you know, holding one mortgage is a big gamble. Holding 1/100th of a 100th mortgages is safer because, you know, 3 of them will go under, but of course you have the other 97.
Yes.
And then it turned out that, guess what? The whole thing is more rickety in a way than the very old-fashioned community bank holding, you know, the local mortgages, right? I mean.
It was yeah. So yeah, I would say it turned out to be more rickety because people thought it was too safe.
Yeah.
So in theory, diversified portfolios would be somewhat safer. But if everyone thinks they're incredibly safe, then you might leverage those diversified portfolios up a great deal more than you otherwise would, and you would take risks that community bank would never have taken.
That does seem to be somehow a metaphor more broadly for our politics and society, I would say, you know, the 07, crash in a way, you know what I mean?
Sure. I mean, it's the sort of like this sort of probabilistic. What I think of this as this probabilistic kind of a thinking has infected so many things, and the very strange version in politics is the way that poll taking has become so unbelievably dominant, where.
Right.
And you know, it's like you can model these sort of statistical aggregates of people probabilistically, as you get to 51%. You only need 53%, which is where, you know, Romney's 47% comment came from. It was, you know, I need 53, the other side needs 53, don't need any more, and then there's sort of just this probabilistic science of getting at that. It has had a certain amount of power. We shouldn't deny that it's had a great deal of power. And then at the end of the day, it has some very severe limits where, you know, if all the politicians are looking at the same polls,
right.
you know, we're just really electing Nate Silver as president or something like that, which is a sort of a strange change in constitutional priorities.
And everyone's micro-targeting, and then, as happened this year in 2016 on the Republican side, at least, a guy blew through who did no micro-targeting, right? I mean, everyone else was picking their lane to run in. I've always, you know, so struck by this. And, you know, what the word someone mentioned lanes to me recently, and I hadn't heard the term in about a month, but early in the primary process in late 2015, early 2016, that was all the talk among political pundits. And it wasn't stupid. I mean, you know, there's the conservative lane, the evangelical lane, the moderate lane, the this lane, governor lane, and it turned out the one guy who seems to have ignored all that, Trump, and just decided, I've got a message, and I'm not right now leading, but I can be leading, and I can go up from 25% to 35% to 45% to 55%. Sort of did that, and it's sort of somehow seems similar to whatever his virtues and limitations, but I mean to someone who just didn't accept the kind of I'm going to diversify my political effort, you know,
right,
or narrowly target my political effort.
I think we're still too close to 2016 to really coherently analyze
Totally,
it. I'm sympathetic to that idea. On the other hand, you know, for all the ways that Trump gets described as this sort of incredibly independent kind of a non-politician, it's still very striking how all the speeches just get started with recitations of polls.
Right.
And so it's again.
But that's more of a snowball thing, don't you think? Kind of a, how do you say that? What the term of
maybe
business is, getting people
yes.
to, it's legitimizing himself by, hey, I'm winning, and then other people want to be.
And so again, maybe it's another commentary on how beholden we are to polls. And so if you're the politician or the aspiring president who talks more about polls than anybody else, that's strangely advantageous.
It's crazy,
which seems again like a very odd but somewhat true statement.
But in a democracy, people want to be on the winning side, and so I think he had a real instinct on that too. That there's a sort of way in which you keep doubling down, so to speak, and people want to be with the winner.
Yes. Well, I mean,
who knows what will happen? But
well, again, these things can work in certain contexts for a while. You can be winning as long as you're winning.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
But there are, I suspect, all these other contexts where this sort of probabilistic approach, has not been terribly helpful. It's politics. At least you can just do surveys. It's sort of somehow related. If you're talking about starting a business and saying, we're going to just do this random walk, we're going to do A/B testing of different types of products and see what people want. We're going to have no opinions of our own and just do all this sort of testing of customers. The problem is the search space is just way too big. There are way too many things you can do. You don't have enough time to go through this sort of statistical surveying and feedback mechanism. And a lot of the things that have worked the best have been sort of paradoxically not so probabilistically beholden.
Right.
If you look at Steve Jobs, Apple, where it was you have something like the Isaacson book on Steve Jobs, where it sort of portrays him as this tyrannical boss who just yells at people all the time. And even if all of that's true, it doesn't seem to me to get at, why did it work at all? Why did it inspire people? And I think it was because there was a plan. You were going to execute against it, and you could sort of pull off some really incredible things that you could never do if you just did everything through this sort of instantaneous feedback from different kinds of things. So I think complex planning, complex coordination, these are the kinds of things that it's gotten very hard to do in this sort of probabilistic society. If I describe to you a complicated plan in a technological context, you think of it as like a Rube Goldberg contraption. It's just not going to work. Something's going to break because we think of every step as probabilistic. If we think of the steps as more deterministic, you just have to get the different steps to work, and you can have a Manhattan Project. There's no reason that you can't do this. There's no reason even the government can't do this. It actually did in the 1940s, and you could send a man to the moon with Apollo, and you certainly should be able to do a website for the Affordable Care Act, since that's demonstrably inferior technology to Apollo or Manhattan.
And I suppose on the business side, if you polled ahead of time, I mean, this has been famously sort of said about Starbucks. I think it's right. Do you want to pay 2 or 3 times as much for a cup of coffee that may not even taste better, really, than the coffee you get in your diner, kind of a bitter European taste or whatever? I mean, people would have said no, presumably. Or in any case, it wasn't clear there was like huge incipient demand or whatever term the economists would use, unmet demand for that. And I'm not sure, even if one polled 10 years ago, would you like to have a little phone in your pocket that you could do this, this, and this? People, maybe not. I don't know. It's kind of, and there is a way in which all that way of thinking about economics does seem self-limiting and misleading in some ways.
Well, it's always this question whether it's that good to just always be looking at the people around you and getting feedback from them in different ways. There's this very strange aspect in Silicon Valley where so many of the very successful entrepreneurs and innovators seem to be suffering from a mild form of Asperger's or something like this. And I always wonder whether this needs to be turned around into a critique of our society, where if you don't suffer from Asperger's, you get too distracted by the people around you. They tell you things, you listen to them, and somehow the wisdom of crowds is generally wrong. The Malcolm Gladwell wisdom of crowds book.
Huge,
And it's always, there's a very specific thesis that it has, which I believe is true, and there's a way the term always gets misused. The specific thesis is that the wisdom of crowds works if everybody in the crowd is thinking independently for themselves. So if we have a jar of marbles and everybody guesses how many there are, then somehow the collective judgment ends up being better than most individuals' judgments. But if you have sort of the more common way the wisdom of crowd works is through this sort of hyper mob-like behavior, where I think you get a lot of irrationalities. You get the wisdom of crowds becomes the madness of crowds. It becomes a bubble in finance, or something worse in politics when it goes very wrong. They've done these studies at Harvard Business School, which I often think of as consisting of the opposite of Asperger-like people. So they are people with who are extremely socialized, extremely extroverted, have relatively few convictions of their own. And you
but good work habits.
Good work habits, and you put them in a 2-year hothouse environment in which they spend 2 years talking to one another, trying to figure out what to do, which leads to this very dysfunctional wisdom of crowds dynamic, where you will simply, because none of the other people actually have thought about it for themselves and have any independent ideas. And they've done studies on this where systematically the largest cohort at Harvard Business School goes into always the wrong thing. So, 1990, they all wanted to work for Michael Milken, sort of 1 or 2 years before he went to jail. They were never that interested in tech except for, 99, 2000, when they descended on Silicon Valley en masse and timed the end of the dot-com bubble perfectly, and on and on. So there is something about this that's very tricky, where, probably a lot of innovation, creative thinking, doing things that matter generally, depends on not being so beholden to the people you're immediately around.
Right.
Even though you get feedback, and the feedback's helpful, there are these cases where it can go very wrong.
And I suppose it's most helpful, don't you think, I would think in a static situation. If you're dealing with a static universe, X number of people, X number of things you can do, then, in a way, getting the most feedback suits you best to deal with this situation, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it doesn't tell you what happens when there's a breakthrough in innovation or some disruptive event, right? And
Yeah, it depends to some extent on what your priors are. So if like my prior is that there's a lot more innovation that could happen.
Right.
And so if the feedback mostly is of the form of anti-theories, can't do that, that's too bold, that doesn't quite make sense. In a world where a lot of innovation is still possible,
right.
This sort of horizontal feedback probably has a very bad dampening effect. If we're in a world where, in fact, everything's been discovered, everything big has been discovered, then this sort of feedback
right.
would stop people from wasting their lives on some sort of quixotic quest of one sort or another. So it does depend some on what your priors are. But if I had to make a judgment on it, I think we are in a world where these feedback mechanisms have gotten far too powerful, where people are too easily swept up by these mob dynamics. I'm certainly not going to go on your TV show and blame this on the internet in any way, but you have to ask whether there are ways some of these technologies have maybe even exacerbated some tendencies that were already there in our society. The phenomenon of political correctness, sort of many different ways to describe it, but certainly one is just that you have these incredibly powerful negative feedback effects that get brought to bear and have this very inhibiting character, and I don't think it actually results in things being far more generative than they otherwise would be. It cuts off a lot of lines of inquiry, but I don't think it means that it opens up that many more.
And final question just on this topic, which is very interesting, I think. It seems to me that conservatives and libertarians, we're both pretty sympathetic, I think, to those points of view. Hayek, one of the great libertarian heroes, and justly so, and a great economist. The fatal conceit, you can't have central planning, which I think has been a very useful critique of big government, nanny-state, welfare state liberalism. Don't you think it's had the effect, just listening to you and thinking about this, of, on the other hand, it's sort of, conservatives have bought into a very probabilistic, or maybe that's not quite the right word, but such a hostility to planning, such a hostility to human conceit, that's almost spills over into a kind of fatalism about human innovation or agency almost, you know?
Yes, so I think that is. No, I think there is sort of a very strange way that some of these ideas developed, and certainly in the area of economics in 19th century, sort of pre-Austrian classical economics, the thought was that you could still measure things objectively. So, how many pounds of steel is this factory producing? How many tons of steel is this factory producing? How many, cars per hour are the workers producing this assembly line? And there was that sort of a intuition about objective value, and there's been this shift towards making things more subjective when it all becomes sort of unmeasurable or there are too many variables to measure. Right. And I think that was, in some ways was started by Austrian economics, and I think now at this point it really permeates all of it. It's not just the right; it's also, the Obama administration wouldn't say that they can have strong substantive ideas of what to do. They can improve processes, right. but they would never actually think that you could actually build a very specific thing in a pre-planned way. They don't even believe in that anymore.
Right. They believe in nudging, right? Isn't that the term? That's
the Cass,
which is a very revealing thing. And you think about
yes.
it, it's such a limited aspiration for.
And it's again feedback from things that are already working, and we improve them a little bit. So we're all just going to climb up, go up the up gradient, and we may get stuck on a low-lying hill. Sometimes you have to step back and wonder, where in the world do we find ourselves? And we just simply go uphill. Do we end up on a low hill, or do we really end up on Mount Everest? And we have all these hill climbing theories. We have no sort of valley crossing, mountain climbing theories, and we need some more of those kinds of things. But yeah, I think the shift towards subjective ways of measuring economics, it then ultimately leads to this way in which we can't even coherently talk about progress. So are we actually progressing as a society? And then the answer becomes, it's just impossible to know. You can't tell. Right. It's just different. There are all these things that are somewhat different, and maybe you're living in a much smaller apartment in New York City than your parents or grandparents lived, but you have an iPhone with a really smooth, flat surface, and so the hedonic benefit from that, how do you trade that off versus the apartment that's a quarter the size of that of your grandparents? And so I think it's hard to know how to think about these things, but I do worry that the stress on these sort of subjective, hedonic, economic measures are excuses we're telling ourselves to hide the stagnation or even decline from ourselves.
Speaking of progress, one of the ways people hope for progress, obviously, is computers, or more broadly, not broadly, but artificial intelligence, I guess in particular, has been a focus recently. But you've given this a lot of thought and been pretty closely involved in a lot of these efforts, or watched them closely, invested in some, I'm sure. What do you think? I mean, are we at some tipping point? Is the world 20 years from now going to look that different in terms of what machines can and can't do?
Well, it's very hard to say, and I've sort of many somewhat conflicting thoughts on this. I don't necessarily come down very strongly on one side or the other of these debates. I would say that certainly computers generally have been an area where there's been a lot of progress. So it's maybe not unreasonable to at least ask the question: how much more progress could there be? How many ways could AI happen? But on the other hand, one of the things I don't particularly like about artificial intelligence is that it has become such a buzzword. I think these buzzwords often always obscure more than they illuminate. And one of the ways to see that it's a buzzword is to see how ambiguous it is. Artificial intelligence can mean both the next computing, the last computing that humans will ever build, and everything in between. And so it has this sort of rather elastic meaning. When artificial intelligence means the next set of computers, it sort of pushes the conversation in somewhat more automation, replacing certain low-skill or medium-skill kinds of activities people are doing. When you talk about it as the last computing device, where you're building a mind that sort of can outthink and outwit any human being, you end up with these very scary, somewhat political questions. Is it going to be friendly? Is it dangerous?
Right.
And if something like that could be developed, maybe it would be on par with extraterrestrials landing on this planet, where I think the first question would not be about, what would this do to the unemployment rate? The first question is, are they friendly or not? Or the first questions would be political. If one, so I think that's sort of a general framework. I would say that certainly the sort of bullish AI consensus that exists is that we're making progress very quickly. There are no deep reasons why computers couldn't do everything better than what humans do, and this may indeed happen, in the next few decades, and that this would of course be an extraordinarily important and transformative set of changes. And I'm certainly open to all these perspectives, but I also wonder whether there's certainly parts of this that one could question. And if you had to be a little bit more critical of it, the sort of the two points of criticism would be to first start with the history, where people have been in some ways too optimistic about AI for quite some time. So in 1970, there were people who said you'd get computers to understand language and everything humans could do within a decade. And same thing would have been said in 1980. And so we've been here before, and so there's been a history where this has turned out to be more difficult than people would have thought. There was, and then of course, there always is this. There's always this sense of whether it's maybe just a particular moment in time where, at the peak of a technology cycle, the only thing we can worry about is technology that's so good that it's too fast and it changes things too radically. There was in spring of 2000, there was this essay that got a huge readership in Silicon Valley by Bill Joy, one of the founders of Sun Microsystems. And it was "The Future Does Not Need Us," sort of how runaway technology would get rid of people. And so in retrospect,
I remember that well, but that's already 15 years ago.
And as a sociocultural observation, as a psychosocial observation, in spring of 2000, what we should have worried about was not whether the technology was going to work so well that it would be this runaway progress, but the real question was it working at all? Were the business models working? And it turned out that a lot of things didn't work that well, and we had sort of a period when people went back to banking and back to consulting from Silicon Valley. The B2C, B2B didn't mean business to consumer, and business to business meant back to consulting, back to banking. And so anyway, I do wonder whether the sort of mini AI bubble that we've seen in the last few years is maybe symptomatic that we're at some local peak in optimism about how much Silicon Valley is doing, can do, all these sorts of things. I think one way, one aspect of it that I think is somewhat disturbing is certainly that there's this sort of probabilistic thinking that again creeps into the AI issue as well. So if you meet someone in Silicon Valley who believes that AI is possible, it's happening soon, and it's potentially dangerous. Let's say these are three very widely held beliefs. The fourth thing that you can always push back on them, you don't want to question those three beliefs, but the fourth one that's a very powerful one to question back is, well, you have no idea of how to build one that's safe, and you couldn't build one that's safe. And the way you've defined the problem, that you're going to build a superior mind that will be able to outthink you, you won't be able to build it in a way that's safe. One of my colleagues was sort of talking to one of the top AI researchers, and sort of pushed him on this, and it was basically, Professor, you obviously don't believe any of your theories about AI, because if you did, you wouldn't be publishing any of it on the internet, because when the AI emerges, it will read about it on the internet, and it will know to hide and to not make you aware of how powerful it really has become. So there's something akin to that that's implicit in all of this, where if the sort of the optimistic case about technological possibility is true, there's a sense of helplessness in terms of what people can actually do about it. And so it's very much linked to this rather dystopian view, and this is reflected in the Hollywood movies, where I cannot think of a single movie from Hollywood about AI that doesn't have a dark and rather disturbing undercurrent to it. And so again, I think it's this sort of probabilistic, reasoning, that things are technologies are out of our control, there's no human agency, we can't actually know what we're doing, that gives it this very strange quality. And of course, there is a sense in which the term AI simply means that human intelligence isn't up to the task. And so, one other way of interpreting the AI boom is that on the surface, it is about extreme optimism about the potentialities in computer technology, and then beneath the surface, it simultaneously is perhaps a great deal of pessimism around the possibilities in other technologies that will be developed by humans, and a deep pessimism about the possibilities for what humans can do. And so it's sort of a man with a hammer sees a nail everywhere. So one interpretation I have of the AI bubble is that it, again, in a strange way, is symptomatic of the technology stagnation thesis.
Now that seems to fit with the notion that we're developed societies and there's not much more we can do on our own.
Yes.
So then this
Yes.
Deus ex machina kind of literally is going to come
Yes.
in and do what, I don't know, but
Yeah, so we're waiting for, it's like
Discover
waiting for
a cure
Godot,
to
waiting
cancer,
for this AI to save us from all these things, and then don't know whether it'll be friendly or not. So it has this very strangely passive aspect where it's somehow there's not enough room for human agency to my liking. Now, certainly one sort of somewhat more basic point that I always try to make is that it's not at all obvious why the question about, let's say, near-term AI, so not the way futuristic stuff, but the next generation or the generation after that, why it should be seen as such an adversarial dynamic, and that we're always talking about computers as substitutes for humans, and yet the reality is they are very different. They are, computers are able to do things in this incredible brute force way. Humans are sometimes able to do things far more effectively, and yet there's sort of ways in which our minds are probably much simpler than we think. It's probably wrong to think of a human mind as having hundreds of billions of neurons, because and that somehow codes for hundreds of billions of things in our mind. You're a really smart person if you have 20,000 vocabulary words, and so I think there is something about computers and humans where they're deeply different, and I wonder whether the focus on AI has somehow obscured these differences. And so the mystery in some ways is why have we actually not built AI?
Right.
And the conventional explanation in Silicon Valley is we have not built it because human minds are so complicated. If you have hundreds of billions of neurons, you'd need to have a computer with hardware the type we haven't quite developed yet, and sort of it's just a matter of time, and we'll get there. But you could make the same argument. You could say this cup here has close to Avogadro's number of molecules or atoms in it, and could never be modeled by a computer. But you don't actually need to model every atom. You can just model the basic structure. And in a similar way, if there is such a reductionist theory of the mind were possible, it could perhaps have been already designed on 1970s or 1980s type hardware. So I think there are some very mysterious questions like this that have not been fully thought through. My guess is that it's possible that there are just these really big differences, and that there's a separate question whether you can brute force a simulation of a human mind, and there probably are ways you can do it, and then there's some limits to that. But they're naturally complementary because they're so different. We normally need to be afraid of people who are just like us, because those are the people we're competing against. It's if you're you need to be. Globalization is scary because it means that you have sort of very underpaid people who aren't that different from us in other countries competing with people in the U.S. and Western Europe. The computers they're complementary. They're not really competing. They would be scary if we had a super futuristic version where we had a robot that looked just like you, Bill Kristol, and we didn't have to pay it any money in any context, and you'd be rightly alarmed by that. And this is
so would many other people too.
And this is the common sense intuition why people are scared of cloning. There's a sort of bioethics cut on cloning, but the common sense reason is that if you had sort of 100 clones of yourself, they'd be competing with you, and you're competing you're always competing with people who are like you, and so to the extent computers are really different, that's, I think, much more of a positive than a negative.
And when you say the human mind is simple, you're saying not that it's easy to replicate, but the opposite, that there's something mysteriously simple about it, so that brute force doesn't replicate at least some of the things that it can do.
Yeah, my view is that it's mysteriously simple,
Right.
and it seems to be able to do very powerful things with relatively few components. So
Right.
maybe there is some relatively simple algorithm that could replicate it, but it's strange that we haven't found that. But it's perhaps not a problem of hardware, which is the naive standard view that we just need more hardware and you'll get it to work.
Yeah, when the computer beat Garry Kasparov in chess, when was it, 97 maybe,
Yes.
something like that, Charles Krauthammer, who knows a lot about chess and knows a fair amount about science too, wrote a cover story for us, which we titled "Be Scared, Be Very Scared," and it's an interesting reflection. I haven't got back and looked at it in a while, but I would say 20 years later, it doesn't feel that scary. I mean, clearly, at a game like chess, with a set number of pieces and a board and rules, the brute force, so to speak, can just at some point surpass even the greatest player. But most of life isn't like that, I think, and one doesn't have the sense that computers are defeating humans in the way that one might have thought 20 years ago would now move from chess to other parts of life. Or maybe I'm wrong about that, but it does.
Yeah, I think it's an open question. So I think it's happened certainly less quickly than people would have predicted
Right.
at various points. Certainly you have day trading. You have all these sort of day trading algorithms where the computers are maybe doing 2/3 of the stock trading on the stock market, or you have certain places where these things happen. On the other hand, things like language translation still feel extremely far away from that. And if anything, the way Google has improved its language translator is to find phrases in books and then see how the humans translated those books. And so it sort of has found efficient ways to leverage off of human translators, and it's not actually any kind of semantic understanding on the level of the computer of what's actually the meaning of the words. And so that kind of a thing still seems very far away.
And day trading is, in a way, I don't know that much about it, but it seems like a good example because it's not stock picking. It's not, let alone venture capital investing,
Right.
which to my knowledge computers haven't. I mean, of course,
Yes,
you
I'm
can use them.
hopeful that venture capital is extremely far from being
Right.
replaced by computers.
Yeah, and the use of computers in those areas is to help people, process data
Yes.
very quickly and do a lot of comparisons and stuff. But at the end of the day, it's not.
Yeah. So the more hopeful view that I still have is that it is likely to be just a continuation of what's been happening since the Industrial Revolution, where mechanization, automation free people up from certain kinds of repetitive tasks and free people up to do other things. And then it can be scary if we're living in a society where there are not enough other opportunities, where there's not enough growth, where there are problems like that. But in and of itself, freeing people up from the drudgery of repetitive tasks is probably a good thing.
Yeah, and the transition can be very unpleasant. And of course, when one reads about it in the history books, I was having this conversation with someone recently, people went from agriculture, from rural areas to the cities, but they got through it, and London was a mess, and everyone writes, you read early accounts of early, Blake and the coal mines and early industrial London and other, more or less London, maybe other industrial towns in England, and it's terrible, but, they get through the problem and everyone ends up well off. But of course, the getting through takes 20 or 40 years and includes all kinds of bad things happening and instability, and maybe we're in such a moment here, you could argue, with all the anxieties about people losing jobs. But there's also so much nostalgia, don't you think? I mean, I'm sorry, it is, if you are a coal miner and you're out of work at age 52, it's very tough and it's hard to adjust and you have to move, or you'll never maybe have quite as well paying a job. And it's easy for me to sit here and say, that's just part of social progress. That's not a very palatable thing to say. On the other hand, one shouldn't be too nostalgic that it was a great thing that we had millions of people in coal mines. That was not healthy,
Right.
Or the assembly line, all the nostalgia now. Trump's getting the votes of, quote, the white working class, the people who were once working in steel mills, and that was great, or on assembly lines. And it seems to me an awful lot of literature was written in the 50s and 60s and 70s about how assembly lines were dehumanizing and cog in a machine and, not a great one would want it to get beyond that, right?
Right, and perhaps if we didn't want Chinese manufacturing to become as powerful, we needed to automate the assembly lines even faster than we did in the U.S., or
Right.
if anything, we didn't mechanize quickly enough in some of these industries. I think the sense of nostalgia that we have is a sense of that there is a lot that we're losing, and the dilemma is that the things that we're losing are very obvious, and then on the other end,
Right.
at the other end of the tunnel, there are many things that we will gain, and we have every reason to think the things we will gain are much greater than the things that we are losing. But it's sort of obvious what we're losing. It's not at all obvious
Right.
what we're going to gain on the other end. I think that would have been certainly true of the early 19th century. We were in the throes of the first industrial revolution, and there certainly are aspects of it that are like that today. But my worry with all these things is if anything, there's not enough happening.
Yeah.
If you take the biggest innovation that people are talking about now, it's self-driving cars.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just going to ask you about that. So let's
that's
talk about
the-
that.
that's the
Is that really
stereotypical-
so big a deal?
And
In a way, I mean, right.
I think there are 1 or 2 million people who are employed as drivers. So it's like maybe 1.5%, 2% of the workforce, maybe something in that ballpark. Maybe it would increase efficiencies because you could get some work done in the car while you're driving to the office. So there would be, maybe it could lead to 5% increase in GDP in the whole economy. Maybe I'm underestimating it somehow, but I think it would be a significant change, but it wouldn't be, it wouldn't necessarily take double our GDP or anything remotely like that. And so the fact that that's sort of the most transformational change we can imagine is again perhaps is to my liking, to my way of thinking, strangely unambitious.
Yeah, well, you famously, like said, they told us what was your famous joke?
They promised us flying cars, and all we got was
Right.
140 characters. So this isn't.
So now we're
this
getting
is better than
self-driving
140
cars.
It's better than 140 characters, and it's.
But self-driving, but really, when you think about it, I hadn't really thought about it this way. The self-driving cars, there's still cars going on the same roads and the same traffic. Maybe it's a little less traffic because there are fewer.
Maybe they can park themselves, so you don't need to look
you
for
don't have
parking.
to keep one. Not everyone will have to have a car. You'll just tell
Yes.
you'll call like Uber. The self-driving car will come get you. So there's less congestion a little bit because there aren't. But
Yes,
still,
I think the theory.
but it's not flying cars. I mean, that is in a way which would have been a
Yeah.
quantum leap, so to speak.
In theory, it could help congestion a lot.
Right.
In theory, it could take a lot of pressure off of parking spaces and
Right.
and things like that. And then at the same time, the fact that this is the technology that's iconically
Right.
the most radical that we can sort of concretely describe. It's more than Twitter, but it's not quite
Not to
vacation trips on the
criticize,
moon
not
or
to
something
criticize
like
Twitter, but right.
that. Well, it's a very good company.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, no, I just like Twitter tweeting. But no, I also agree there. It's that this is what it's come to in a way. There were huge breakthroughs, obviously, real breakthroughs. Email, I find all that stuff is pretty amazing.
I mean,
Google
it would
search,
be,
but
a self-driving car would be, I would say, almost as big as the car itself. But I would still say that the original invention of the car was bigger than the self-driving car.
yeah, I think
Again, if you
so.
sort of had to give the rough qualitative,
yeah, from horse
level
and
on this.
buggy to car is a bigger
that seems like a
jump
bigger
in
change.
people being able to, in lessening distance. I think that a car to a self-driving car, which certainly doesn't lessen distance at all. It of course makes it easier, But it is sort of like Uber replacing. I don't know. Yeah. No, it's funny. I was thinking the exact same thing myself, but not quite in this context. That it is the iconic next breakthrough, but it's not that big a breakthrough,
Yeah, but so there are, and then there are, then there are of course quite even a company like Uber where you have this major innovation. I often wonder whether it's more symptomatic of the failure of certain political structures. So
Right.
the vision in the 50s and 60s was that you'd build very high-speed transport systems, which in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live were basically vetoed by local zoning ordinances. And so it's sort of like this very second-best solution because you couldn't build the much faster kinds of things that people thought were natural in the 50s or 60s to develop. And so it's a compensating device for sort of the dysfunction of our cities, where there's not enough parking, So you don't want to drive your own car. You can never find a parking space. It sort of ends up being, and then the public transportation systems don't work.
Cabs are limited medallions,
So
there's no market system for taxis.
All these things that are dysfunctional, and then we have this innovation to sort of ameliorate the dysfunction. But if the political systems worked better in our cities, this would be sort of a, we might be doing some very, very different kinds of things.
So you're more worried still about the lack of real technological breakthroughs, if I can put it that way, than this notion that we're on the cusp of all kinds of technologies which will be dangerous to us and out of our control.
Far more worried about the lack of good technologies than the danger of evil. So I feel as a venture capitalist, I see all these, bad forms of bad technology, bad science, where it's things that just don't work. The cool sounding things. The general problem with them is not that they're ethically problematic; it's that they just don't work. And then, or the things that do work are often on a scale that's incredibly modest. There's often a way in which humor is used to sort of hide disturbing truths from ourselves, and people made fun of technology in the early 20th century. The humor was to disguise how scary it was, how much it had changed, how drastic it was. And today, it's like people throwing virtual cats at one another on the internet or something like that. The humor, we make fun of technology. It's to hide from ourselves the disturbing fact of how trivial it is and how small it is. So people are still worried about what's going on, but I think it has a very different feel from what it did 100 years ago.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Any last word of relative optimism, however? I mean, it is striking. We're here actually having this conversation. We're about to go to a more academic conference on the mastery of nature, sort of modern philosophy, and its attempt to conquer nature, and in a way, the amazing success. But in a way, so much attention has been given to the downside of that, and was it a bad idea in the first place, or is it if we now has it created as much harm as good? Is it out of control, as we were saying earlier? But in a way, you're taking a very interesting and sort of contrarian view that maybe the problem is that we need to recapture a little of that early verve of the attempt to conquer nature for the relief of man's estate or whatever.
Yes.
I mean,
I don't think we've lost it altogether, right? And so there's always and there's always a way in which the post-2008 malaise. The silver lining to this is that there is a sense that we need to do new things. We can't just keep going the way things were. And there was a complacency that you could have had 10 years ago that I think you no longer quite can have today. People are far more open to this idea that perhaps there's been not as much technological.
Do you find that when did you first introduce the idea?
I wrote about it first in 2011. I was starting to talk about it 3-4 years earlier.
Right.
And certainly even in 2011, people thought this was very crazy. And at this point, even in Silicon Valley, there are people who sort of said, "Yeah, I've thought about it some more, and I think there's actually, there's a lot to this." So there's more of an openness to this notion, and maybe that's the first step in getting out of it. You have to realize that we've been wandering in a desert for 40 or more years now, and not in an enchanted forest, and that's how we find the first step to get out of it.
Yeah, 40 years is a good time to end the wandering in the desert, I would say.
I think it's a little over 40, but
right.
It's time to leave.
Peter, thanks so much for taking the time to have this conversation, and thank you for joining us for Conversations.